Here is a story for families of young children or even older children. This is called The Legend of the Easter Egg, and it is a story that happened somewhere in America 100 or 200 years ago during a scarlet fever epidemic, which is similar to the pandemic that we're dealing with in our world today. And I thought I would read this story and give parents and families some ideas, because I know children are feeling stressed, and sometimes children's stress is expressed differently than ours. And there are things that we can do to help them cope with it. So I'm going to read The Legend of the Easter Egg and hopefully give you some ideas as I read about how we can help each other get through these stressful times. One April morning, when the air was soft and sweet, a boy and his sister went outside to gather eggs. "Easter's coming," the sister said. "Let's pretend we're hunting Easter eggs." "What are Easter eggs?" the boy asked. "Don't you remember?" the girl said. He thought and thought, but he couldn't remember. He was going to ask again, but just then she scared up a hen. "Look!" she cried, smiling. She held up a rosy brown egg. That night, the boy woke to the sound of his name. "Thomas." His mother's face bent over his. "Your sister is sick. Papa must take you away." Thomas let his mother slip off his warm nightshirt. He held up his arms as she pulled a sweater over his head and sat down when she tugged on his knickers. When she told him he could not see Lucy, he nodded. When Papa told him where he was taking him, he smiled. But he was not really awake, and he didn't really understand. Life for many of us has changed dramatically, and for children, those changes can be a lot harder to understand than they are even for us. You notice the mother's face in this picture. You can see from her face that something's wrong. And often children pick up our emotions and our stress and react to it just from the way we look and feel and deal with life. They often have a lot of questions, and sometimes they're not quite sure what to ask, and sometimes they might even be a little afraid to ask. So just kind of be aware of one another during these times and give each other a little extra time. When he woke again, Thomas didn't know where he was. His bedroom was gone. Mama, Papa, and Lucy were gone. But before he could even think about being scared, his eyes grew wide and he sat bolt upright. Had he died? Was this heaven? Because all around him was candy, long branches of licorice, and tiny jeweled rock candy, yellow, white, purple, and pink jelly beans, marshmallow chicks, and tiny chocolate eggs. He stood up very slowly. "Good morning, Thomas," a familiar voice said. It was John Sonneman. Thomas had come to stay with John and his new wife Mary at their candy store, just as Papa had said. This is a time for a lot of changes, and sometimes those changes can be fun and exciting, and it's a good idea to look for the things that are fun, different, exciting about this, because there will be a lot of things that are difficult to cope with. Unfamiliar surroundings, new people possibly, being in a completely different place than you are used to being. But try to find the good things. Try to make the best of what you can. All that long Wednesday, Thomas helped Mr. Sonneman in his store. He filled jars of candy. He weighed chocolate on the tippy scales and scrubbed the counter till it gleamed. All day Mr. Sonneman let him eat smidgens of fudge and bits of broken peppermint sticks. When he finished cleaning out the cook stove for Mrs. Sonneman, she looked at him and laughed. "Goodness gracious," she said, "you have ash on your face." With her thumb she wiped him clean. He smiled, but inside his heart felt as dusty and gray as the ash. His sister was sick. He couldn't be with her, and there was nothing he could do. Often, even when we distract ourselves with different activities in the new settings that we're in, there will be moments like this that all seems well, but inside we may be thinking and feeling things that we're just not quite sure what to deal with. Be patient with one another, with children particularly. Those thoughts and feelings often come out in behaviors, refusing to do something, crying, whining. And a lot of those behaviors are telling us, I don't understand, and this is difficult, and I'm anxious, and I'm overwhelmed. On Sunday, after church, Thomas went outside to play. At the edge of a small stream, he broke off a young reed, put it between his two thumbs, and blew. Squawk! Okale! A red-winged blackbird sang in reply. Two swallows whirled overhead. Cheer! Cheer! They cried. Suddenly, Thomas threw the reed at them, then snatched up pebbles and threw them too. A robin cocked his head, peering at him with one eye. Tut, tut, it chided. Silly birds, Thomas muttered as he turned away. Getting out in nature is a great way to deal with stress. There are many walking paths that we can utilize as long as we're being safe. But remember that, like Thomas throwing rocks at the birds, often behaviors come out, and often those behaviors indicate sadness or grief or anxiety. But the longer we're in nature, the longer we walk, the more our body actually releases serotonin, which is the chemical that helps us to feel better and to deal with life better. Many more days passed. Thomas learned that Lucy had scarlet fever. It was a red rash that covered her body. Her face burned with fever. Every night at dinner, John Sonneman prayed for her to get well. Sometimes Mary Sonneman felt his forehead. He wished he could be sick too, but his body was white and healthy, and his face was cool and dry. On Thursday, Mary sent him out to trade for eggs. When he returned, his shoes and socks were caked in mud. Spring, Mary laughed, so beautiful and so messy at the same time. Kneeling, she took off his shoes and socks, then cleaned his feet in a pail of warm water. The water tickled his toes, and for the first time in days, he giggled. Remember, sometimes these situations like we're dealing with now take many days. We're already 3 or 4 weeks into this, and in many places in the world even longer. And we know that we may have at least as many more days and weeks coming down the other side as we have had going into this. So be patient with one another. Remember, even in the muddy moments, to find some happiness in it, and to try to be as patient as possible. Water is also a very relaxing agent for children. A warm bath, just letting them spend a little extra time playing in the bubbles, playing in the warm water, is often very calming for children when they're anxious, and for adults too. Friday dawned bleak and cold. At noon, the stores all closed, and everyone went to church. Thomas listened to the story of Jesus' death. The minister talked for a long time. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow, he said. While the adults shared bread and wine, Thomas slowly ate a white peppermint. Then he ate a pink peppermint. For a while, he forgot Lucy. Snuggled up under John Sonneman's arm, he fell asleep. This is a great coping skill for times of stress. Snuggling close together, reading stories together, having worship together, talking about God's plan, giving reassurance. This is one of the reasons that I've spent a lot of time reading stories online, because that's one of our favorite parts of the day at school, and one of the things that I am hoping that I can continue to provide, because I think that will help with some of the stability in this time. Thomas woke to bedlam. Lanterns and candles flashed against the dark afternoon. Overhead, something terrible battered at the roof of the church. Thomas gripped John Sonneman's hand as the townspeople crowded at the doorway, peering out. "Hail," they said. High above, the church bell swung wildly, pelted by icy pebbles. As the afternoon passed, and the hail turned to freezing rain, the bell fell silent, frozen. Many of us feel like we're being pelted with hail right now, but we're inside God's arms like they were inside the church, and I think that's a great thing to remember as well. That night, as Mary Sonneman tucked him into bed, Thomas asked, "Is Lucy going to die just like Jesus did?" "Shh," said Mary. "She will not die. She is just very sick." "I want to see her," he cried. "I want to be with her." "Soon," Mary said. "She's almost well. You will see her soon." She put her hand into her pocket and pulled out a small chocolate egg. "Here is your first Easter egg," she said. "Sunday is Easter. On Easter, you will see your sister again." Answering children's questions as simply and honestly as you can brings comfort. And giving them some sort of a timeline, I know many of us don't even know that timeline right now, but giving them constant assurance that it's going to be okay is very helpful. Thomas remembered hunting for eggs, and he remembered the question that Lucy had never answered. "What are Easter eggs?" he asked again. She pressed the small egg into his palm and wrapped his fingers around it. 3 days after Jesus died, early on Sunday morning, some women came to Jesus' tomb, she said. They were sad. They had come to mourn. They had come to mourn Jesus' death. But when they arrived, they saw the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. Thomas held up the egg. "Did the stone look like this?" Mary laughed. "Yes, only much bigger and much heavier." Often stories help us deal with stress as well. Reading a story of how other people have dealt with crises or stressful situations in their lives can help bring hope and comfort to us. And the Bible is filled with all kinds of stories that we can share with our families and with our children, and show them how God has helped other people deal with stressful situations, and He will get us through as well. Mary continued. Then an angel came and told the woman that Jesus was not there. He was alive. Filled with joy and fear, the women ran to tell the other disciples, and that was the first Easter. But why do we have Easter eggs? Thomas asked. Mary explained, just as a chick breaks out of an egg, so had Jesus broken free of the tomb of death. Easter eggs remind us that Jesus conquered death and gives us eternal life, so Lucy won't die. Mary shook her head. Someday she will, and you will too. We all will. But if we believe in Jesus, we will see each other again in heaven. That is the promise and the joy of Easter. She tucked the blanket under his chin. Remember, she said, believe in Jesus, hope, and pray. That's what you can do for your sister. All right? Okay, Thomas agreed. There's often a lot of mixed emotions when we're dealing with stressful situations. Sometimes there's joy, sometimes there's pain, sometimes there's fear and anxiety. Realize that those mixed emotions come out in children, usually in behaviors. So often what they need, even sometimes instead of discipline, is understanding and reassurance. All day, Thomas stayed inside and colored eggs. Outside, the freezing rain fell, but inside, he stood near the glowing cook stove, dipping eggs. As he plunged the cool white eggs into the warm red dye, he thought of Lucy's fever, and he remembered the story of the Easter egg, and for the first time in his life, he prayed, all by himself. Find some fun things to do together, and don't miss the opportunity to teach your child to pray all by themselves. Very early Easter morning, before anyone woke up, Thomas filled a basket with colored eggs and slipped out the door. As he walked, the sun came up, and all around him the world began to sparkle. The twigs on the trees and the tiny buds sparkled. The stubbled wheat fields and the long waving reeds sparkled. Even the ice-bent daffodils and crushed violets, the trampled crocuses and the battered hyacinths glittered like jewels in the muddy farmyards. Thomas caught his breath. He had never seen anything so beautiful. He passed the cemetery. The gravestones, too, twinkled in their shining gowns of ice, and the church bell began to ring. So even though there's been a storm and it's left ice hanging everywhere and it's done some damage, we can still look for the beauty in all of the experiences that we have in life. When Thomas got home, Thomas bounded up the stairs to Lucy's room. Finally, he would see her. Finally, he would tell her of the story of the Easter egg, of his faith in Jesus, and his hope for new life, and the love they shared that would never, ever end. One of the great things to remember is that this whole thing will end, and we will be able to come back together, and we will be able to share some wonderful things with each other. Our older students are learning to keep a diary, because if we study history, There have been many diaries written during times of history-making moments that we're reading today. And so that's one fun way of remembering things that maybe we can do with all of our children, is to draw pictures and write things down so that we can remember things. And drawing and writing are also great ways to talk about and to get out those emotions and those feelings that we may all be dealing with. I hope you enjoyed this legend of the Easter egg. I may record this again without me sharing so that the children can enjoy just the story, and you can use that to start discussions with your own family. The legend of the Easter egg.